Hello, I am Caroline Goulard. I have created 2 companies in the field of data visualization. I have been working for over 10 years to build bridges between humans and data. And we are together for a new episode of The Bridge, the media of artifacts that democratizes data and artificial intelligence. Today, we are with Hanan Ouazan. Hanan, hello.
Hello.
Can you introduce yourself? Of course.
So, I'm Hanan, a partner at Artefact, and I am in charge of all our offerings for the UN Group on AI and AI topics, generative.
Can you first define for us what is an AI agent? What is agentic? Well, that's a very good question.
It's true that there are, I think, many definitions in the market. They are not all equivalent. My definition, because it's worth it. The agent for me is an autonomous system capable of executing tasks in order to achieve a result while also being able to adapt to its environment. And I emphasize that adapting to its environment is very important. This is what gives the agent a certain flexibility in carrying out the tasks you ask of it. So that's the agent logic. Agentics is something a bit different. Because with agents, you need to be aware that for them to perform these tasks, you can do 2 things. Either you tell them exactly what to do and they do it, or you tell them what you expect from them and they figure out how to do it. Here, I have a feeling it's the second point. It's this ability to define what needs to be done to achieve the goal. So, really, to put the concepts in perspective, an agent does things automatically for a goal while being aware of its environment. Agentics is an agent for which you haven't predefined the way to do it, and it's the one that, through its thought process, identifies the optimal path to accomplish the task.
Today we're going to talk about AI agents, artificial intelligence agents. Can you explain to us what that is, of course?
Well, first of all, I think we need to be aware that it's the word we're going to hear the most in 2025 if we're interested in the topic of generative AI. Technically, agents are somewhat the evolution of what we've had over the last 2 years. We experienced with ChatBT 2 years ago the first generative AI models as we know them today. And this notably allowed us to have models with which we interacted, we asked questions, we get answers. Then we had what we called assistants. So these were generative AIs that were interconnected with our systems. And that's where we saw use cases, for example, FAQs, what we call RAG use cases, where technically what we do is we take the generative AI model and connect it to data sources. And as a result, we managed to better contextualize the answers and be more precise on the topics. Now we are reaching a third stage where AI is not only connected to information systems to respond more accurately, but is also connected to action systems. That is to say, AI is no longer just in read mode, but also in write mode. It can perform tasks. This agent logic is precisely about how we give AI the ability to act on behalf of its user and carry out actions. For them, that's where it gets really interesting. And it's also where, in a way, we have crossed the gap to a third level. There is an interesting point also to highlight, which is this logic of RPA. We talk a lot about RPA. It's something that has existed for years. So, RPA, for the acronym, stands for Robotic Process Automation, and it's the art of automating processes by breaking down the process into a set of tasks that are sequenced, and on which, in the end, we achieve a result. Example. I go to my bank's website or my phone operator's website and I'm asked to upload my ID. So I take a photo or a scan of my ID. The scan is uploaded. The AI will read my ID, take my name, first name, date of birth, height, and will take this information and enter it into the bank's or phone operator's information system. So that's RPA. It's a 3-step process. So reading, extraction, insertion into the database. What happens if tomorrow, I am not a French citizen, but I am an American citizen? But the ID will still be different. It will probably be written in English. And so if I use the same RPA process to do this work, what will happen is that it will crash. Why? Because the RPA is not designed to read English. It's not designed for this ID card format, and so it won't work. What we can do now with agents is to bring this flexibility by using generative reading intelligence to adapt to these format changes, to adapt to these language changes. And so the agent will be able to say to itself, oh, look, it's written in English, but well, name means a name. So I understand that it contains the information. And so in a way, we will bring this additional flexibility to the RPA logic.
What is really new so that we understand well? Is it this aspect of autonomy that we are able to adapt? Is it this aspect of writing and not just reading? Is it the mix of both? No. That's a good point.
I think the writing aspect has always existed. With RPA, we could also write at the bottom of the page. What has really drastically changed is this adaptability, as you mentioned, but it mainly stems from this intelligence. It's that AI is capable of having a critical view of itself, analyzing the environment it is in, and making decisions based on that environment. RPA, what I like to say is, imagine that tomorrow you're following a route in a car where you're told after 3 seconds you turn right, after 10 seconds you turn left, after 20 seconds there's a roundabout and you continue straight ahead. If I tell you that you have to follow this route to the letter, and let's imagine that the route isn't changed, you'll get there without any problem. What happens if tomorrow, after 3 seconds, there's a grandmother crossing the street and you were supposed to stop, brake, or if tomorrow the city council decides to put a speed bump in the middle of the road, and so you have to brake, obviously all the metrics I gave you to follow the route no longer work. That's the problem with the RPA metric. It's that, in fact, it is capable of functioning in an environment that is exactly identical to what we had planned. Whereas with generative AI, in a way, what we're going to do is tell it, you know what, you follow Waze. And so, if tomorrow the traffic changes, if tomorrow something happens and alters the route, you are able to adapt. And so, you see, it's this paradigm that has changed with generative AI. It's this intelligence, this ability to adapt to the environment. And
So what's the use of it? Because I feel like it's extremely broad.
the use cases, clearly, that's why it's a bit of a topic today, because it's very, very broad. I think it would be pointless to list all the use cases we can think of. I like to talk about 3 major categories that I believe will be truly impacted by this agentic logic. The first category, I think, is everything related to customer relations. We've seen this now, it's been around for a while, all the chatbots that can answer questions, etc. But we need to go a step further. That means the chatbot handling your FAQ, that's so 2024, so 2023. Well, I'm exaggerating, but in reality, these are things we have mastered. So today's companies are working on achieving a level of reliability that is 100% perfect, etc. But these are things we know how to do. Now, what's really more interesting is if the chatbot is capable of being smarter than the FAQ. For example, I'm on the chatbot and I say, hello, I have a network problem, I can't get internet on my phone. And so if instead of telling me, you know what, I'm going to check the FAQ and I'll let you know. Your problem number 1 might be because your settings are incorrect, or because there's an incident when you're at home and if you can't connect anymore, or because you've used up your data plan, etc. So what the FAQ will do is give you a list of possibilities, and then it will be up to you to explore each of the given options and form an opinion and potentially solve your problem. With the agencies, what we can do is go further than that, is to say, you know what, I checked in the CRM what plan you have, and I saw that in fact you have a plan with 100 gigabytes of usage per month, and I noticed that you have used up these 100 gigabytes. So I assume the reason you no longer have internet is because you've switched to limited bandwidth, and therefore you're not getting a good connection anymore. You see, this ability of the agent to go and read in the different systems, to think, to make a decision, and even afterwards to suggest to you, to tell you, if you want, you can take the higher plan with 120 gigabytes less. Or for this month, if you think it's exceptional, to pay €2 to get 5 gigabytes more. And so, for this month, you won't be penalized. And so consequently, for example, to tell you, if you choose option number 1 or option number 2 to update your contract, you see, it's really the next step where, in a way, we can go even further in the customer relationship. That's the first topic. Obviously, there are other use cases in customer relations. I'll go over this quickly. But for example, assisting the agent who takes the call to help them solve the customer's problem. We can also do very interesting things. Analyze calls that have taken place in the call center afterwards, and propose improvements to, for example, reduce volume in the long term. These are also things we can do. There are a lot of use cases during customer relations. I illustrated with the chatbot because I think it's the most illustrative example, but there are plenty of things to do. The second category, which is also very interesting, is what we call the back office. The back office includes all the jobs that, in fact, today involve processing that happen somewhat behind the scenes in many companies. So the example that I like to tell about this is, for example, you are someone who wants to buy a property. And so you apply for a loan from your bank to actually get a mortgage. And so what happens when you go through a digital process in general is that you go to the bank's website, you fill in information, you provide, for example, your last 3 pay slips, your contract, your electricity bill, proof of residence. For certain loans that exceed certain amounts, you sometimes even have to provide blood tests. In short, a certain amount of information that is then analyzed in the back office by people who will review all the information, check that it is correct, and that the information matches properly. Then they will use credit simulation software, take all the information, simulate it, make you an offer, and then send you an email to tell you either it's rejected, and then, however, you don't know why, or they tell you actually it's accepted and here is the rate. And in fact, this whole process takes time because someone has to, first of all, obviously they don't just have your credit file, they have many, and on top of that, they have to take all your documents. It can sometimes be 10 pages that are needed. Read, scrutinize, fill in, manually enter into software, simulate. Understand why the simulation is good or not. Good, have a critical view, etc. Big smile. It can take, 4 or 5 days just to get a response. And in the meantime, you're waiting and you don't know whether or not to make an offer to your seller. Well, tomorrow, with generative AI, we can imagine a completely different process. You upload the various documents, the AI comes in, it reads the different documents, it extracts information, it interfaces with the simulation system, it runs simulations, it tells you yes or no. If it tells you no, it explains why. It gives suggestions to do better, and if it tells you yes, it says, you know what, if you have this rate, but if you increase your contribution from 15,000 to 22,000 euros, you drastically reduce your credit rate because you've reached a certain threshold. You see, it's completely different. One, you have the time perspective, but you can go from 4 or 5 days to, in reality, let's say about 20 minutes, 32 minutes for it to process. Obviously, you'll have your answer within 24 hours because there will be an agent, a human who will review and analyze all that, but the time has still been drastically reduced. And 2, you have gone even further than the current process because when you have a rejection, you explain why, something that doesn't happen all the time. You provide suggestions to improve the application, and even when you receive a positive response, you offer improvements to achieve an even better rate. So this is typically the kind of process we are looking to automate with agents. And finally, the third category, I think, includes all use cases related to development, software as well. We will talk about it again, I think, later, but it makes sense to say today with these AIs which are capable of coding, of deploying things in production, how we can drastically change tomorrow the way my company, I develop my software, I develop my projects, my use cases. And so there's an entire profession, a bit of the developer's role that is being rethought around these AIs. And it really promises a lot of things.
What are the main categories of agents? Is there a classification? Do they have little names, different complexities?
Well, yes, that's a very good question. There are several categories of agents. I like to group them into 3 levels, really based on their autonomy capabilities. Let me explain. Level 1 is what you see a lot of today in the markets. It's what you see in tools like Copilot. These are agents, what we call prompt agents. So Basically, you give them a prompt, a rule of the game. They want A and an order. You will say, here you are, an agent that does this, that, this. You have access to this information, this PDF and this information system, Google Drive, SharePoint, whatever you want. And you will help me answer these questions, etc. So it's an agent that, in fact, what it does is it comes to automate tasks by breaking the task down into many small steps, and which will therefore allow you to automate certain things. But we are really at the task level. So we automate tasks. I will provide you with an ID and you will extract the information and put it into a database. It's a task, 3 steps, as we explained earlier. This is what we see a lot of today in the market. It's the most common. It's great, but in reality, when you automate a task, you've automated a task. This allows you to go faster on the task, but it doesn't change your day. Because in reality, today, if we really want to redo things, we need to redo processes, not tasks. And so the question arises of how I can automate processes and not just tasks. This is where we really have the second level, which is what we call workflow agents. And it's also here, in this workflow agent, that we somehow bring in what we mentioned earlier about RPA 2.0. That is to say, I take a process as in RPA and I completely automate it with agents. What this will allow is to really assemble the different tasks. So you see, we take the maturing context, but we make it a chain, and we move from an initial state to something that is a completed process. And so we go a step further than level 2, and we bring, compared to RPA, much more flexibility, as we mentioned earlier, with the example of, for instance, the quantity piece. It's in English, it's not in French. So that's level 2. The limitation of levels 1 and 2 is that for it to work, I have to explain in detail to the AI what it needs to do. I have to tell it, you will first do this, then that, then this, then that, and so on. To do this, you have access to this API, you have access to this information, you have access to this knowledge base, etc. The AI can, at the level of each task, have some flexibility, as we explained, but still, it must follow a certain path that you have predefined for it. So, it still provides robustness because, in a way, you have forced the AI to conform to a process that you have defined. On the other hand, you would like, sometimes when the process is not existing, or when the process today, you find it tedious, or when the process is perhaps sometimes unclear, you would like the AI to bring a bit of flexibility. So that's where we have the level 3. This is what we call, well, it's so new that there isn't really a nomenclature yet. I call it Goulard, agent. So you no longer define a workflow, you define a goal. You say, you will have to do this for me. You must accomplish this task. And to do so, you have access to this knowledge base, these tools at your disposal, and then it's the agent itself that will chart its course. You see, it will no longer follow a preconceived path. It will chart it itself. So it brings a lot of flexibility. It's much more autonomous. However, in some ways, it's also much less robust. Because if tomorrow it takes the wrong path or diverges, or what do I know? In fact, there's a process that doesn't go very well. You can't do anything and it can get stuck. When we know, and this is the important point, that these agents, somewhere behind, to function, they rely on generative AI models, and that these models are ones you pay per use. An agent that is autonomous in how it uses the models, it is autonomous in how it consumes. So be careful with the bill. This is where it's not obvious. This is also why it's a system and a level that is still not widely exploited today. It is still very much in the research stage. It will bring a lot of flexibility in the future, but it still requires having a bit more control and a bit more confidence in this ability to do things on its own without us defining somewhere the steps to follow.
This topic is still new, and for me too, I find it hard to fully imagine. Basically, are we talking about an agent, an AI agent that will be super competent to the point of knowing how to define its own processes, or is it actually by assembling several agents that we achieve that result?
That's a very good question too. Today, it's a bit like in a company. Often we say, I'm looking for a 5-legged sheep. So first, it's complicated to find. And second, the five-legged sheep in the end gets sore, because if it does a lot of things, it's complicated. So logically, the way we create agents, the best practice is to say, when you have processes that are very specialized, what you do is you put in place what we call an orchestrator agent. So it's the project manager, the manager, who has an overall view of the process, who understands well how things work, and is able to allocate the different subtasks to very expert agents. So in fact, you have a sort of project team with an orchestrator agent, expert agents, and the role of the orchestrator agent is to, you see, streamline the process, assign tasks to everyone, and wait for feedback from each one. Parallelize certain tasks when they can be parallelized. You see, sequence them when they can be sequenced. And ultimately, obtain the correct answer. Now, after all that, well, it remains under the paradigm we mentioned of whether this orchestrator agent and this expert agent, should I hard code them at the beginning, give them the steps to follow? Or do I just talk to the orchestrator agent, say, hello, you have access to all these agents, you have access to all these tools, figure it out. And then it serves you its work. So, as we explained, there are different levels. Today, we are more on the part workflow, meaning you still provide the steps, but obviously tomorrow and even today, there are frameworks that exist. You can talk about Crew, AI, AutoGPT. These are things that exist that do this, but which still, for me today, are not suitable for production use in a company.
You know, it's funny, we quickly start to humanize them, these agents, comparing them to project managers and all. And it echoes the recent statement by NVIDIA's CEO, Jensen Huang, who said that IT directors would become somewhat like HR directors for these AI agents, these new digital workers. What do you think about it?
At first, I found it very funny. Quite visionary, though, because it raises real questions. When we think of an agent, we think of AI. When we think of AI, we think of code. When we think of code, we think of IT. So we wonder if tomorrow, if all my business processes are agents, isn't it IT that will manage all that? I think it's important to keep in mind an agent is automating a process. A process is something related to business. So if tomorrow you say it's up to IT to manage a business process, in a way, it means you've misunderstood the role of IT. And the other problem too, I think it's interesting, is that if tomorrow all processes had to go through IT and had to be managed by IT, there's a real question of scale that arises. If tomorrow your company has 1,500 people, and I tell you, you know what? HR. Tomorrow, we multiply the size of the company by 10, reaching 15,000 people. Your first reaction is to recruit people to manage all these individuals. It's the same. We're not going to say, now there are agents, I'm going to multiply the size of my IT by 10, because we're going to have thousands of agents everywhere. So this raises two questions. And it reflects the fact that first, having IT, who is the HR ball of the company, it's not desirable, and it's not necessarily desired either. And so to ensure it doesn't happen like that, or at least not only like that, we need to rethink how agents will be managed over time. That means, as we said, an agent, it's a business process. That means it automates things that are business related. So if tomorrow the agent doesn't work well, IT might not necessarily have the answer. IT will tell you, I don't understand your chatbot on the site. It responds, I ask a question, it responds. Now, if the response isn't good, it's not IT's job to know why. It's up to the business to know why the manager isn't responding correctly. And so it necessarily requires acknowledging that now part of the application maintenance. When we think of maintenance, we really think of IT, but part of the application maintenance will have to be escalated to the business. And so it will be up to the business to analyze the chatbot, understanding what the chatbot says, detecting when the chatbot says nonsense, and potentially correcting it. I use the example of the chatbot, but it applies to all the agents you can create. And so it's important, I think, to train the business on these issues. And secondly, also to give them the right tools, because for the business to be able to diagnose an agent and debug an agent, they need to have the means to understand where it doesn't work. And at that point, potentially mobilize the data teams, the ML teams, etc. But then to react to his quote, I find it really interesting. It raises a real question. And it is clear that perhaps in terms of recruitment for the HR department, and in terms of purely administrative aspects of the HR department, it will be IT that takes on that role. But career management and the life cycle of employee agents, I think it will be more up to the business to start maintaining that with obviously the right tools that need to be implemented.
Because there's another thing when we start talking about HR, we also hear about corporate culture. Is there a topic on training these agents so that they react in a certain way within the company, that they are adapted to the code, to the culture?
Of course, we worked with one of our clients on precisely a chatbot, more of an HR agent, that is supposed to help employees with onboarding. And so obviously there was a huge amount of work on how I give this agent the brand's tone, how I ensure that it isn't something very cold. So, if you want to automate a process that is often a human process, you have to be extremely careful that this process does not degrade, that this automated process does not come to degrade the experience. If tomorrow I are a company and you create a chatbot on your website, it must respect the tone. It cannot be cold and impersonal. Otherwise, somewhere, you have sacrificed your brand image on the altar of productivity. That is not necessarily what is desired. Today, these agents are capable of doing that. They are capable of integrating this logic of corporate culture, but obviously it's a job to be done.
We've been quite interested in the agents, but if we now return to real human workers, what is the perspective for them? And before saying that we are going to replace them all, first, how does it change their way of working?
Well, I don't think we are going to replace them all. It's very important to keep in mind that it's a bit like with the Industrial Revolution. When we had the Industrial Revolution, there was a real issue that arose about saying, now I put lots of machines in my factories. And so inevitably the people who were on the assembly line and who worked, they were somewhat replaced by these machines. But these machines and the productivity gain they brought also raised new problems, or rather new questions. The first question is, how do I monitor these machines? How do I ensure they are working correctly? How do I ensure that what is produced by these machines meets the specifications and standards we have defined? When it's a human agent somewhere, they make it, they look at it. But when it's a machine, you don't have 100% confidence in it, so you want to have a quality process. So it creates additional jobs. In some way, people who were previously responsible for building will tomorrow be responsible for evaluating. And the second point is that, in fact, it's always the same. When we gain productivity, generally we do more things. There is time to do more things. And to do more things, you need people who think about what to do. So in some way, when you spend less time on task execution, you have more time to spend on designing the tasks to be executed. So you still have people who will become process architects tomorrow and who will have to rethink how things work and perhaps create new processes. Typically, as we mentioned earlier, when you create agents and those agents automate processes, your goal is not to take the human process and automate it. You shouldn't do that, because otherwise the human process includes waiting 2 days to receive the email from HR. You don't need that when you're doing the same thing. And so there's a question of how to redefine the process in the era of AI and agents to somehow do it better. And so 2 new tasks arise as immediate corollaries, and I'm not even talking about all the tasks that will come and that we might not have thought of right away, but the task of quality. So how do I evaluate, supervise, and monitor all this? And the task of process design, I think that in the future, people will have tasks that are, I believe, much more intellectual and also much more focused on control, efficiency, and the evaluation of this automation that we have implemented.
And if we look at the people who make software, we touched on this a bit earlier, but for them, concretely, to what extent does it change the way we make software today?
That's a very good question. I think there are several angles to it. The first angle, we mentioned earlier about the code. When today I develop software with tools like these, it allows me to develop faster. You know, in all software, there's the same syndrome as for journalists. There's the blank page syndrome. It's extremely complicated to get started. You write code, I was a data scientist in my younger years. I'm not that old, but when you write code, the hardest part is to start your egg code. So to write the first lines, to decide where to begin your process, where to start your work. And so with these ideas today, you can very quickly bootstrap, meaning start a first version of your project. Obviously, it won't be perfect, but it immediately gives you a first draft, a first attempt that you can improve upon. So already in terms of software, it allows for a huge gain in productivity. The second point is that when you create software, you often get feedback from users, and it takes time to integrate because you first need to ensure how you incorporate this feedback somewhere, whether it is relevant or not. And once you've integrated it, how you assess that the feedback does not cause harm or damage to the rest of your software's features. So with these generative ideas, you'll already be able to bootstrap ideas faster, thus integrating ideas more easily, meaning can I do it here, here, here? What happens if I do it here, 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 here? And secondly, you'll also be able to conduct impact studies much more efficiently and simulate the incidents it might cause on your software. Both in the design phase and in the life cycle phase, the evolution of your software, you'll move much faster. That's the first point. It's just the software development. It changes the game. The second point, which is very interesting, is to consider that today's software has been designed for human use. The example you see, I would love that next Friday, let's imagine I'm not working. And I tell Leah, you know what, Friday I'm not working. I'd like to go on a long weekend with my wife. I have a budget of 900 euros. I'd like to go somewhere less than 2 hours from Paris. I want a place where there's sunshine, and I'd like to do extremely relaxing activities, unwind, visit, etc. And then there are probably some needs. He thinks, okay, I'm going to look at all the destinations that are less than 2 hours from Paris. I'm going to check by plane and by train. I'm going to filter for places where it's warm, where there's sunshine. Then I'm going to look for places where there might be, I don't know, a spa or things like that. And maybe potentially an important focus on culture. And then it will suggest to me, you know what, you can go to Lisbon, you can go to Prague, you can go to Corsica, you can go here and there. If you choose this option, here are the activities to do, here's the hotel I suggest, here's the flight I suggest, and the budget for each of the options. Then I say, very well, option number 1 in Prague suits me perfectly. Can you then make the reservation? So the AI automatically makes the reservation. To do this, you have to imagine that the AI will connect to APIs of different software. Potentially, if there are no APIs to simulate clicking on Windows to be able to do all that. It's laborious, it's not easy at all. If tomorrow we want all these automation systems to work better, we also need to rethink how agents will have to interact with the software. And so there are many things currently being implemented. Notably, for example, an interesting thing is Anthropic, which has shared a protocol called MCP. It's a protocol they want to make standard for everyone. And it will be a protocol that redefines the notion of an API. I'll give you an example. This time from a company, I created an agent that potentially helps me find information when I have questions. And so this agent is connected to my Google Drive, my SharePoint, and my Confluence. When I ask a question, the agent will query each of the systems independently by connecting to each of the APIs, respecting the protocol of each API, retrieving all the information, and then critically analyzing everything to make a synthesis. It's extremely laborious. If I have to create this agent, first, I need to connect it with the different APIs, write the different APIs, the correct code to connect with the different APIs, and then create this loop of self-reflection to synthesize all that, have a critical perspective, etc. So I'm not saying it's impossible, I'm saying it's laborious, and if tomorrow I want to add a fourth system, it's the same all over again. So Anthropic thought of something. They wondered if we shouldn't reinvent the API so that in fact all the systems in the world speak the same API. And so when tomorrow I am an agent, I will connect to a system. Well, I follow the same protocol as everyone else and it's the same way of communicating, so it goes much faster. It's a bit like in the working world, we all speak English by default, in theory. And so, in a way, when I address a client, I don't know what language they speak. I will speak to them in English. I'm sure they will be able to respond. It's the same logic, you see. And so, in a way, we have to think about redesigning systems so that tomorrow we can integrate this automation and do it much more efficiently. That's the second point for software and website auditors, etc. And the third point is also to ask ourselves what the SaaS of tomorrow is. I'll exaggerate, but a SaaS is 3 layers. It's a UX. It's intelligence, the workflow that the SaaS accomplishes, and then the data that is manipulated through this SaaS to carry out these workflows. We said that the UX tomorrow will evolve because firstly, people will automate tasks, so there might not even be any direct interaction. And secondly, potentially, they won't automate it, but they will interact with an interface like Gemini or ChatGPT or Cloud, so a chat, and thus the UX of the company, or rather the UX of the software, will be used less and less directly. And so, in a way, this weakens one of the fundamental pillars of a SaaS, which is the UX, the way of designing user journeys. On the other hand, you have the intelligence that today creates the value of the software. You use it because there is intelligence that automates tasks, but which today is very limited to the software. This means that tomorrow, I will automate a business process. That process doesn't depend on a single software in general. It depends on 10, 15 software applications. So if tomorrow the automation logic is embedded in the software, each software will have its own agent. So it's going to be a hassle to orchestrate each of the agents with its own little language, etc. The agent needs to be taken out of the software because the goal of automation is to be cross-software. So the intelligence, in a way, indirectly will be shifted outside of the software. So we have the UX that is no longer very interesting, and the intelligence is partially shifted outside of the software. Then there's the data on which generally the developer has worked extensively to have a good data model. But in reality, it's a data model that contains your data. So in this world where the UX is less useful, the intelligence makes less sense within the software, and the data is only a third. I don't know. I don't know how SaaS should evolve tomorrow, how SaaS should perhaps interconnect with 2 systems, and should have much broader open protocols. To say my agent, I create it in this software or in that software, but they can communicate with each other. It's the same communication protocols. So you see, real questions arise about the openness of software and what it will imply for their business model, for the companies that use them, and especially for this vision of automation that is cross-software. So I don't have the answer. I mean, there was a great podcast recently released in which Satya also questions the interconnection of tomorrow. You see, his example is to ask whether tomorrow Apple will allow me to automate things with Office Copilot on the iPhone. You see, it's a real question because it would mean that Apple is giving the right to internal software to automate things within its hardware. All these questions arise, and the SaaS business and the vision of SaaS for tomorrow will, I think, have to evolve, if only because of this point and the 2 others we discussed just before.
So let's imagine there are some UX designers listening to us. Do you see any reassuring prospects for them in this new world?
Well, of course. You see, I exaggerate each time because obviously I'm projecting into the future. And to project, you need a wall. So there has to be a wall somewhere. So naturally, when you hear that, you think, oh, well, wait, all jobs are going to disappear, etc. No. We still need UX because there are plenty of things for which today it's better to have a UX. You see, your iPhone is full of applications. You have Siri on your phone. You might have TaddyB on your phone. But there are things you do on an app because it's faster to do it that way. So I'm not saying that tomorrow UX will disappear. I'm just saying that tomorrow UX will evolve to no longer be the only entry point of an application. And so it's mainly for the publishers that the question arises rather than for the people who do UX. Then an important point as well is that UX is not just about input, it's also about reading. For example, when you read a news application, you don't input, you don't need an agent to read. The question of how you read and the UX of reading still arises. That's the first point. The second point, so what I advise those who do UX today is to take an interest in these tools for automating code creation, which will allow them to spend much more time on deep UX reflection rather than on how to code. And the UX itself, in fact. And so in a way, we take a step back, as I mentioned earlier, and adopt more of a UX architect's logic, a UX designer's logic, rather than UX implementers. And that's where there is a real paradigm shift. And so these people, tomorrow, we expect them to do even better things. Because if they have spent less time coding, we hope that the experience as a result will improve in quality because there is more time to devote to it. Perhaps my advice for them is to take an interest in these tools, in code automation, because tomorrow it will allow them to be even better and more relevant in the experience they wish to bring to their UX.
So where exactly does the market currently stand today on these agents?
So the market today, if I go back a bit to the 3 levels, is very positioned on level 1, which is Copilot. On level 2, we see things today regarding workflows. On level 3, not at all. It's still far too experimental. What we do see appearing a lot recently, however, are agents that are called perceptive agents. So I didn't mention this earlier because I don't want to muddy the waters. There is a lot of vocabulary. But let's remember one point, which is that for the agent to truly become intelligent, in the future, it must not only interface with APIs. In the future, this agent must also be able to interface with UX. I'll give you an example. Tomorrow, if you have software, with an API to interact with the software, if you are within this software and use the API to interact with it, you will quickly be limited. Why? Because an API is designed to interact with the software from outside the software. It's a bit like if you and I were doing this interview over the phone while we're next to each other. An API is the phone. It's designed for talking when we're not next to each other. When we're in the same room, it's more efficient to talk directly. Similarly, UXs are designed to have more functionalities than APIs. And so if agents want to deeply interact with software in the future, they need greater capabilities than just interacting with the software's API. And so that's where solutions like the one recently proposed by Ash come in. You know, the startup that raised over 200 million euros in seed funding. They offer agents that are not only capable of analyzing APIs and thus have LLMs that connect and all that, but are also capable of having vision capabilities. So they visualize UXs and interact with these UXs accordingly. So there will be a major focus on the perceptive agent. The agent that not only interacts with its environment, but also visualizes its environment and interacts based on its visualization. I think that's going to be a huge project in 2025. And notably, you know, there are many promises today about having GPT chats or Geminis that will interact with your Mac or PC. And so inevitably, these technologies will need to understand what's happening on your screen. And so this is where we'll have this concept of a perceptive agent, which I think will be an important topic for the future. Another topic which I also think we need to keep an eye on is this concept of technological building blocks for professions. We talked about it earlier with Jensen, the CEO of NVIDIA. If tomorrow professions need to take into account part of the maintenance of applications, I think they should also have suitable tools for that. So the logic of how I build trust in AI, how I build trust in what I implement, how I set up the right supervision tools, especially for professions, is a market that will develop around this. This market already exists today for IT and data scientists, but not for professions. So there are still many things to put in place. And I think it will also be a major trend topic for companies. And finally, I think of a much more professional topic that is also very interesting, which is the logic of governance. Tomorrow, I provide Copilot or Workspace Gemini to all my employees. They will create agents everywhere. How do I manage that? Can you imagine if tomorrow I gave all employees the ability to recruit whoever they want with artifacts? It's going to be, I don't know, I don't even have words without staying, to stay polite, but it's horrible. So if tomorrow we want to give people the ability to recruit whoever they want to assist them, we still need to have some kind of governance and control over who we recruit, how we recruit, and ensure we don't recruit for the same position twice, etc. So there is a logic of governance that will be established because in a world where agency and agents will become commodities, what are the business processes they will implement to still maintain control over all this?
Do you already have some feedback, some insights from the field on mistakes to avoid or best practices?
The mistakes to avoid, I think, are believing that it's magical. In fact, this is where it becomes quite divisive because all these technologies have shown that we can do things very quickly. But these are things that work, yet they don't function. That means the demo goes really well, but when you go into production, it's immediately terrible because it's expensive, because it says nonsense, because it hallucinates, etc., because it takes too long due to latency, etc. So what I advise companies is, first of all, to ask the right questions about how they are going to industrialize all this. Doing POCs for the sake of doing POCs is pointless. And in a world where POCs are cheaper and done faster, we might be tempted to do a lot without worrying about tomorrow. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't do a lot. We need to test, experiment, but it's absolutely essential to establish the fundamentals so that we can industrialize tomorrow. This involves the governance logic we mentioned earlier, which is very important, as well as the platform logic that will allow us to support these use cases tomorrow, monitor the use cases, supervise them, manage costs, manage latency, etc. Many very important concepts in production that are often, I think, neglected when starting a project.
To project a little into the future, we're already quite ahead of the future, but how do you see the sector evolving in the coming years?
That's a €1 million question, or even more. I think that we will have more and more reflection on these processes. Because the promise of generative AI has really been the promise of gaining efficiency, productivity. And what we've managed to do so far is more about reducing the duration of tasks. We haven't yet reduced the delay of the processes. So actually, this is where there's an interesting paradigm, which is that what we've managed to do over the years is that for a process that takes 2 weeks, each task takes less time, but the process still actually takes 2 weeks. Tomorrow, when we manage to overcome this genetic milestone, we will truly move from a 2-week process to a 2 or 3 day process. So that's where we will really see, I think, real productivity gains. And that's where we will notice real changes in the way we work, collaborate, etc. So I think the future will be very focused on this automation of processes, with obviously all the questions we've raised, questions about work, societal questions, software questions, business model questions, questions about interactions between different agents, etc. I think there is a massive project coming with questions for everyone. And it is very important, I think, to have a good understanding of these concepts to build your business strategy as a result. And consequently, prepare for a world in which the ways of interacting change, the ways of thinking change, and the ways of communicating also change. And honestly, I am very open if someone has the answer, but there are still many uncertainties.
It's funny because what you just described, in the end, we've already experienced that with the arrival of computers in businesses. There was the arrival of computers, and at first we didn't see any productivity gains. And in fact, we saw that yes, maybe the secretary has a computer, but if the boss continues to dictate his letters to the secretary who now has a computer, we haven't changed the process and we haven't made any real productivity gains. I feel like what you just described is somewhat the same thing, but on the scale of artificial intelligence.
Exactly. Artificial intelligence is truly a revolution, and especially this concept of agentic, which is as powerful, I think, if not more powerful than what we had with smartphones, what we had with computers, what we had with the internet. Today, with each technological start, in fact, we have this little step forward where we do the same thing, but better. And then we do things differently. So for me, the answer to how we do things differently is agents. So we're not there completely yet, but we're moving in that direction. And if I could perhaps give something that comes to mind immediately, but I think we've had, you see, the models, the assistants, the agents. And so what is the future of that? Well, I don't want to say it's general intelligence, etc., because Terminator is nice, but it's not happening anytime soon. However, this is going to be interesting. It's about how tomorrow I manage to integrate these AIs and these agents into robots. Autonomous cars are becoming much more concrete today when we have an agent capable of understanding, interacting with its environment, and making decisions. Before, we couldn't do it. So, you see, it's also the logic of the agent. Tomorrow, we have to consider that if it is capable of understanding, analyzing, and being aware of its environment with its eyes, there are many things happening tomorrow in the world of robotics. You know, notably, Elon Musk talked about his humanoid robot, on which he wants to implement Grok, which is his generative model, tomorrow. That's truly it. I also think that tomorrow, let's not forget that there will be uses beyond what we've discussed, potentially in factories, or in our daily lives with autonomous cars, autonomous taxis, etc. It's a bit more not for right away, especially due to regulatory issues as well, but questions like these about the robotization of processes also arise.
For those who want to delve deeper, we don't necessarily recommend Terminator, but do you have another film, a book, a conference? Well, there are plenty of resources on the internet.
What I recommend is paying attention to philosophers and informers. Today, everyone has become an AI expert. It's quite exhausting. So be careful about what you read, and above all, don't trust everything you read either. That's the first point. The second point is, I think today, we are fortunate to be in a world where the knowledge of the knowledgeable is very accessible. So today, if you want a perspective on generative AI, you can listen to Jensen, you can listen to Satya, you can listen to Pichar directly. And actually, these people communicate because there is a communication issue from the company's side on these matters as well. So it's interesting, I think, to already know what Al Maltman thinks about the future, or what Mark Zuckerberg or Satya or Jensen thinks. And so they do a lot of conferences. My primary source of knowledge is simply these people who know more than we do and who, sometimes also indirectly, provide insights into their strategy. Because it's a bit like a game of connect the dots. When you listen to the conference and understand their product launches, when you understand a bit of their deployment strategy, if you can draw the line, you also understand a bit better where they want to go.
Anand, thank you very much. You're welcome. I hope you enjoyed this episode. We'll see you very soon for a new episode of The Bridge.